Hello friend, welcome back. In our previous video, we successfully get our specific ID data and visible that things in our view page, right? So right now I want to do, if you go here into these positions like in our album, into this album that have also one of the specific column ID as an artist ID. So now I want to get a specific this artist ID, all that name, that means all that album name, I want to get it and I want to visible it in our this page, that means in our album list page area. So before doing this, I also want to share one thing with you. I want to compare our SQL query and then our Django query. Like here, you can see that is our, when you actually get all the data from to the database table. So in our SQL, we actually define that this query, right, as a select all from our database table name. But in Django, if you want to get all the data, then you have to define that things with your table name and then all objects, that there is the objects and all data. So that is actually the relevant, that is the same query. Okay, so this query is actually used for our SQL query and that is for our Django query. And also if you search with a specific one of the ID data, so previously we have already defined that part, that means this SQL. So into the SQL we have defined as a select all from our musician table where ID will be as a 1. That means there is actually one of the specific ID, right? So previously we have already defined that part, that means where ID will be as a 1, and in Django we have defined that things it did a little bit different way. In Django we have defined that our table name, that means our table name as a musician, and then objects, and then if you want to get a specific data you have to define that as a get, and then you have to define as a pk, that means the primary key is equal to 1. That means you get all that primary key 1 ID specific data. So here you can define that things like that way. And also here, if you want to get a specific row ID data, that means here you can see into the SQL we have defined that things like that way as a select all from our album, that means a select and then all from our album table, and from to the album table where our artist as a 1. The artist means actually if you compare it with in our this table, so here I have defined that field name as artist underscore ID. Okay, that means here if you compare it, it will be as a artist underscore ID. So in this position I want to get only a specific artist underscore ID 1 ID data. Okay, so that is actually the SQL query. So if you want to run this same code into the Django, then you have to define your table name as a album, objects, and then you have to define that filter. So with this filter here you have to define your this row ID data, that means which row ID I want to take. So here you have to define that as a artist ID. So right now in our database field as a artist underscore ID, right? So with this artist ID you have to get your specific ID data. So now we will use it, because with this we want to do with a specific artist ID all that album data I want to get. So that means there is actually the one specific row ID data I want to take. So for if you want to do that work, you have to work in our view, into the view, and that is our album list. So here I want to take it, so better in particular that position. So I just take one of the variable as a album list. Okay, I just take as a album and then list. So that will be as a album list, and into the album list variable I want to define our table name. Our table name will be as a album, right? Because I want to get all the data from our this table. In our model I have already created this table as an album. So I just simply copy it, and here our album table, and then we have to define as the objects, right friend? Into the objects, then if you want to get a specific row ID data, then you have to define as a filter. I have already discussed about that things, right? You can see that is actually the I want to get a specific this row ID data. So if you want to get this row ID data, then you have to define that as a filter. So I just simply define as a filter. Okay, and into the filter here you have to define your field. So here I have defined our this field name. If you go to our model, into the model I have defined this field name as an artist. Okay, so by default database actually created this ID, that means the artist underscore ID. So here we don't need to defining it, because I have already defined this field name in our model area as an artist. So for the reasons here I just simply defining it so as this one, that means the artist. So I just simply define in particular that area as an artist. And also after that artist, we have to define our is equal to one ID, right? That means this one actually the ID. So here is equal to, and ID means here in our URL, into the URL I have already defined one of the ID, so that is actually our ID, right? And also I define this ID in our function. That means into the function, here you can see I simply define our this requested ID. So that is actually our requested ID, means if you go here, you can see that is actually our requested ID. Okay, if you go home, if you go to the Kazarian, you can see that actually the one ID, that means the one requested ID. So this is the ID I have defined. I have defined that things with this artist ID. So now I just simply define our this ID. I hope, friend, it should be very much clear to you how I get our specific row ID data. And now I just take all the data and take the things with this variable, right? So now we have to pass it in our album list page, because here I want to visible it. So if you want to visible it, then you have to pass it in your diction. So simple things, I just simply define our album list. Here I just pass our album list. Okay, friend. So I just simply pass it. So now we can use it with this album list. So now we want to use it in our album list page. So now go to our album list page. And here, first of all, I want to take one of the HR. Then it will be better. I just simply define one of the HR tag. And now I want to display it with using one of the table. So better I just simply define as a table. And to the table, I define as a TR. That means a table row, and then I define as a TH, that means the table head, and I just name it as a album, right? Album name I want to display. And also after that, better I just copy it. I also display our all that field. So right now that is our field name. So that is our name, the release date, and also the rating. Rating is means actually that a number starts. So that is a 3 field. So I just simply define as a album name and the release date. Okay, release and then date. And also I want to take another one for the rating. So I just simply define as a rating. Okay. So now we have to visible it. So that is our TD. So after that I want to take another tier. So I just simply define another table row, and then also we have to define that our TD. So I just simply define the TD. Okay. So into the tier, that means here I want to add our for each loop. So if you want to add that for each, I think you already know about it. So here I define as a for, and now I just name it as an album, right? I just name it as an album in, from our view page, I pass it as an album list. So I just simply copy it and I just simply paste it. So here, whatever you want, actually you can, I am using that album. It doesn't mean that you have to use that album. You can use anything as per your demand. Okay. So now with this album, we can actually display all that our album field data. So now with this album, I want to display our album name field. If you go in our model, into this model, I define that field name will be as a name, right? That means that is actually our database field name. If you go our database, you can see there is the name, there is a release date, and there is our number stars. Better go to the structure, that is actually the name. I just simply copy it, and now here I define with this album, I want to display our name. And also we have to finish it. So we have to finish our for loop. So here I just simply define as and for, I just simply finish it. Okay, friend. So that is our and then is our table. And after that also we have to define our another field name, our another two of this field. So here our another field is a release date, and for the release date our field name as a release date. Copy it. I just simply define our with this album as a release date, and also there is another one as a rating, and rating field name I have defined as a number stars. So I just simply copy it. So with this album I define as a number stars. Perfect. So that's all you have to do. Now let's check this out. If you now click as a save all, I just click as a save all, everything is perfect. Now go here. Now I just go to the home. Like here I define as a Kazarian. Yes, now you can see, friend, now that is actually our all the data comes from our which table? this data actually comes from our musician table. And also here I define that our specific row ID data with our specific row ID data as a artist ID. With this artist ID, now I actually get all the data from our album table. Now you can see now for the Aryan, here I have defined the Jack. So now if you compare it, go to the browser. Now you can see Aryan, actually that means ID as a 1, right? So 1 ID that I define as a one of the album. So an album name as a Jack, and there is our release date, and also I display that rating, and also another one, and that is our name, that is our release date for this album. Perfectly is now displayed two of this on here. If you go to the Jackson, you can see for the Jackson I have defined one album, so that is actually one album is visible. So if you want to add some of the class, that means in our table I have used some of the table. So in the Bootstrap there have also one of the table class. Like into the table position, I define one of the class because I have already added our CDN, that means a Bootstrap CDN. So I define one of the table class as a table, and the table bordered. So I just simply define as a table border, RTERED. Okay. So this type of one of the class in that is one of the Bootstrap class. I'm using it. Click as a save all, and now refresh it. Yeah, you can see it's now looking perfect. So that is our album name, that is our release date, and that is our rating. Go home, Kazarian. Yeah, everything is now perfectly visible. And also here right now they have the only two data. If you want to get all the data with the order by thing, I think you already know about it. Then here you have to do. So that is our artist. So here you have to define our as a order by, and then order by what the field you want to define. If you want to order by the name, if you want to order by to the release date, you can defining it. So right now I'm using that name. Okay, I am using that name. So that is our order by and then name. Click as a save all. So right now there are only two data, so it should be same maybe. You can see it's now actually same. So if you have multiple data, now it should be organized. That means you will get all the data order by the name. And also here I defined that rating. So right now they have the two rating as a 5 and the 4. So if you want to find out that average value, then you can also defining it. So in Django they have also another model. So we have to first of all here we have to first of all import it. They have also one of the building models. So I just simply define as a form and then Django. Okay, Django and then DB and then model. Okay, models, and into the models we have to import it. Sorry. So we have to import average. So that is also one of the building model as average. So now we have to define that things on here. So for doing this in particular that position, okay, here I take another variable. I take it as a artist rating, artist underscore rating. So this type of one of the variable I just take, and then it should be just same. I want to define that album, our class name, and then objects. I want to get all that objects and then filter. Okay, then I just simply define as a filter, and filter will be our artist. So our artist will be our artist ID. That means the artist ID, and after that they have also one of the method as a aggregate. I just simply define as a aggregate, AZZREGATE. Maybe I'm not sure, actually I forget it. So it may be aggregate. Okay, so now let's check this out. Here I have to define that aggregate, and then with this aggregate we have to define our this building one of the class. So here I define that class as a average. Okay, so into this position I want to average our which field. I want to average our that is actually our field name. That means here I have defined all that our ratings, right? So that is our field name as a number stars. So I just simply copy it, and now here in our average area we have to add it. So that means that is actually our number stars. Okay, so number stars, I take the things with this variable. So now we have to also pass it in our dictionary. That means here I want to visible it in our album list page. So after this I just simply define as artist rating, and then I name it as artist rating. Okay, so now with this artist rating we can actually display our average value. So now go to our album list. Here I want to display. So here after this I just take one of the H4 tag. I just simply define as the H4 tag, and here I name it as artist rating. Okay, artist rating, And now in particular that position I want to visible it with this artist rating, because from here I pass it in our dictionary as a artist rating, right? So with this artist rating we can actually visible it, so I just simply define as an artist rating. And also here we have to define our field name. So I have defined our field name as a number stars. With this number stars, also here if you want to define that average, then you have to define that average. Okay, like I show you, if you display it, you have to do after this here you have to define your field name, our field name as a number stars, and with the number stars I want to do and display the average, that means AVG. Okay, that means the AVG. So if everything okay, now it should be visible. Let's check this out. If you now click as a save all, now I just refresh it. Yes, you can see it's now perfectly working. So that is actually our artist rating as a average. To is automatically calculated two of these. As I told you, they have the building one of the method, they have also one of the building one of the class. Sorry, that is also one of the building class as a average. So with this average I have defined that aggregate, and with this aggregate I define our average. So now it's perfectly calculated two of this field data, and now it's perfectly visible. So I hope you can well understand about it, friends, and step by step I think you are going to like it, right? Because everything, as I told you, if you know that basic, all that things, how much easy to create one of the project with the Django, I think you will understand it. So here, friend, for the code applications, I have already complete our two portions. That means from here now I can insert that data, and also from here we get a specific our data, right? From here also we get that data. So now we have to complete our edit and the update portion, and also the delete portion. So how can edit your album with a specific one of the ID, and also how can delete it step by step. In our next video I will show you that things with a live example. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.